And this morning we are going to take a close-up look at the state government shutdown. Now, I believe that this audience remembers it, but I have to say I was listening to a TV or a radio program, listening to colleagues, I'm like, I think they forgot. I think so. You kind of wonder how long people's memories are, but I know everybody in this room is familiar with it. So what we want to talk about is why did it happen? Who were the players in the final deal, and what impacts did it have on the business community? What do Minnesotans think about the shutdown? Who are the winners? Who are the losers from a political perspective? And did anything really get resolved? For answers to these questions and many more, I'm pleased to welcome this morning our keynote speaker, David Schultz. David Schultz is a professor in the Hamline University School of Business and the School of Law, where he teaches classes in government ethics, public policy, public administration, and election law. He is also a senior fellow at the Institute of Law and Politics at the University of Minnesota Law School and teaches election law, professional responsibility, and state constitutional law. David is the author of more than 25 books, 12 legal treatises on eminent domain, and over 80 articles on various aspects of law, ethics, public policy, and the media and politics. He is regularly interviewed and quoted in the media on these subjects, and he does maintain a blog, schultztake.blogspot.com. Did I get that correct? All right. And he also writes a regular column for Politics in Minnesota. So please join me in a very warm TwinWest welcome for David Schultz.
Thank you very much. As I get started, I want to take you back to about October of 1998. There was a guy named Jesse Ventura running for office, you might recall. I remember receiving a call from the Chicago Tribune. A friend of mine was a reporter there. And they said, we don't know much about Jesse Ventura. We know he was a B-movie actor, a wrestler, but we don't know much about him otherwise. We'd like to interview you about Jesse Ventura and his prospects for election. Asked me a whole series of questions, but of course the question they really wanted to get to was, is he going to win? I happened to be reading polling data from Minnesota Public Radio at the time. I said to them, based on the polling data, again, this is about the first week of October, I said to them, Jesse Ventura has high name recognition, high positives, low negatives. He's gaining in the polls. His opponents, high name recognition, high negatives, going down in the polls. My sole quote to them was, he has a chance. Didn't think he was going to win, but I thought I'd be the optimist. Of course he wins. The day after the election, I get a call from People magazine. People magazine turns to me and says, Professor Schultz, congratulations. You were the only person in the country who successfully predicted that Jesse Ventura would win. And I said to them, I didn't predict he was going to win. I said he had a chance. And they said to me, you were closer than anybody else in the country. That counts for us as good enough. I say that because of a couple of reasons. One is that when people wonder sometimes why I get called so much, I say it's because I just happen to be closer than anybody else, not necessarily because I was right. And the same thing will be true today, too, in terms of my talk, hopefully about the shutdown and try to understand something about it. That I may not necessarily be right, but I hope to at least get close in terms of being able to sort of tell the story about what happened. Well, in putting together the story of the shutdown, clearly a couple of months ago when I was contacted about giving the talk here, we had to come up with some type of way of sort of making you folks interested in the shutdown. And so one of the possible titles was going to be Anatomy of a Murder. Another was going to be something about an autopsy. I mean, I had thoughts in my head running through in terms of playing games like Clue when I was a little kid or something like that? You know, are we going to find that the persons who were involved in the shutdown was this, you know, the maid with the chandelier in the, you know, in the den? Was it the waiter, you know, or rather not the waiter, but the butler, you know, with the knife in the kitchen or something like that? And so let's think about it perhaps in terms of the murder mystery on one level and say clearly a murder took place in the state of Minnesota last spring and last summer. The victim was, of course, the state budget in the state of Minnesota in terms of its national reputation and perhaps in terms of its fiscal future. Evidence of the crime was all around us. We saw a government shutdown, acrimonious bickering, and a budget deal that clearly nobody was happy with. And that when we walked away with a compromise that, as opposed to everybody saying it's a compromise that we can live with, it was a compromise that I think the consensus was that was not really good for the state of Minnesota. So what we want to figure out is who was the killer? What were the motives, the weapons of choice? And ultimately, what verdict can we render regarding, if we were a jury, regarding everything here? And as we're doing an autopsy and a postmortem of the body, that is, of the budget deal, we need to ask a series of questions clearly regarding that murder that occurred. And what those questions would be are something along the lines of why the shutdown? Why did it actually occur? Second, I have to sort of do this, of course, in terms of saying that the parallels between what happened between the Republicans in the legislature and Governor Dayton bear striking resemblance or foreshadowing, or whatever metaphor we want, to what happened just a few weeks later with the debt deal shutdown, or debt deal showdown, I should say, at the national level. And so perhaps speculate a little bit in terms of, you know, is Minnesota that microcosm? You know, are we sort of the harbinger of American politics to come? People used to say, either as Maine goes, so goes the nation, or as California goes, so goes the nation. Is it perhaps now, as Minnesota goes, so goes the nation? And then what we want to do is, since I think when we get to the questions, we're going to kind of go in wide-ranging areas, perhaps we can look at Minnesota politics, the shutdown, what happened, in terms of looking at two other victims who were left for dead as a result. And those two other victims are going to be Tim Pawlenty and Michelle Bachmann, because we may try to connect this now to the presidential race. And so we have lots of death, lots of carnage to talk about here in terms of thinking about what happened for the last few weeks. And let us start by saying that what I want us to think about here is what I've talked about for the last few months is the emergence of what I call the new normal in the state of Minnesota. And what do I mean by the new normal? Well, let's think about it. For those of you who read your Minnesota Constitution, and I know every one of you keep a copy in your vest pocket and read it daily in the mornings like I do, you will know that the state constitution specifies, and I'm going to probably get the language a little wrong, that says that the regular session must end on the first Tuesday after the third Sunday in May. Now, of course, it's etched in all of your minds. Of course, you know that, and we'll do a quiz afterwards on this date. And you think about it, when we have the regular session that's supposed to end by that constitutional deadline, what that specifies is that we're supposed to accomplish, that is the state government, is supposed to finish its work, its appointed task by that deadline. And the primary task, of course, during the odd years, I don't mean odd as in unusual, odd as in numerically odd years, the task in the odd years is primarily to complete the state budget. However, if we think about it in terms of what that's supposed to mean is that's supposed to be the norm. A norm is supposed to be that the work is done by that date, and we get to go home and do whatever we're supposed to do. Perhaps in earlier days in the state of Minnesota, the date was set in place for a whole bunch of reasons regarding sort of the farmer, legislator, or whatever it may be. But that's supposed to be the normal. But what we're starting to see now is the existence and creation of what I've been calling the new normal in the state of Minnesota. And the new normal has lots of different components that we want to think about in terms of what have come together. And this is how I'm going to put together the whole idea of thinking about the shutdown. Because what I'm going to argue is that the shutdown that occurred this year was the product of several short-term forces and several long-term forces that have been building in the state of Minnesota, the product of both political forces and non-political forces, by that structural, in terms of how we think about the state of Minnesota. But in terms of thinking about the emergence of the new normal, for people whose minds are sort of short or who don't remember a little bit of Minnesota history, this was our shutdown, of course, of 2011. But think and work back a few years. If we want to think back to the last legislative session where one could say that we actually got the budget done on time, where the legislature adjourned at an appropriate point, and where, let's say, there was minimal controversy regarding getting the budget done, was what year? 1999, the first year that Jesse Ventura was governor. It was in that year that we actually completed the task on time. Now, yes, there was a little bit of debate that was out there. If you'll recall, Jesse Ventura decided to then line item veto several items in the state budget. And of course, he did it in a way that was ensured or guaranteed to produce wrath among legislators. If you recall, he used little pig stickers next to the items that he did not like and put them there. And what that did, of course, was to produce one of the great instances of bipartisanship in the state of Minnesota after that, because the year afterwards, the Republicans and Democrats came together and in veto-proof majorities to teach Ventura a lesson and overturned many of his line item vetoes in the process. And so one of the great things that was produced in 1999 was to show that when all else fails, find a common enemy and you can bring the two parties together. And that did occur in that situation. But 1999, I argue, is sort of the last year in terms of something approaching budget normalcy in the state of Minnesota. Since that time, what did we have? A few years later, in 2001, we had the near shutdown. In 2005, we did have a partial shutdown for a while. I'm forgetting the exact date we now had a few years ago, where we had, in a non-budget year, we didn't pass a capital budget when we normally do something like that. And then, of course, in the 2009, if I remember correctly, 2009, we had Governor Pawlenty trying to use the unallotment authority to try to address the budget problems. And that didn't work also, and eventually the court overturned substantially what he did. And so we have this numerous series of problems regarding the budget for quite a few years in terms of trying to get it done and get it done on time, with two shutdowns, an unallotment, and a near shutdown in the process. None of this looks very good when we think about it in terms of the pattern of Minnesota politics and the budgetary process the last few years. But we shouldn't just look at the fact that we've had budgetary problems. Let's also look at our political landscape in the state of Minnesota in the last few years. Now, some people might say that in 1998, when Jesse Ventura was elected, this was sort of a golden moment for the state of Minnesota in terms of suggesting that perhaps we can elect third-party candidates. And perhaps that is an accurate description. We can talk about it. But it also clearly was a sign in many ways that Minnesotans were not happy with the normal polarization between the two major parties. Karen Louise Booth, one of my friends who used to work for Minnesota Public Radio, once described the election of Jesse Ventura in a very interesting way. She said, recall in 1998 that we had 2.2% unemployment, we had about $4.5 billion surplus, and we had just won the tobacco settlement in the state of Minnesota. Her description was, off the record, of course, she would never put this on the air, is that she said that 37% of the state of Minnesota gave the state of Minnesota the finger. And it's a very apt description in terms of saying we don't like, pardon my language, we don't like the normal way politics is being played. We want something new to occur. We want to break from the normal. But think about it again. Since 1999, we have now had two elections, both the U.S. Senate race, the longest prolonged recount in Minnesota history and in U.S. Senate history, actually, and then we had a governor's race that also went down to the wire with a recount. Something strange seems to be going on in the state of Minnesota. We also have, as one of my colleagues described it, an interesting grouping of people in the state of Minnesota. We have produced Governor Ventura on one side, we have produced Al Franken and Paul Wellstone on another, and Michelle Bachmann and Rod Grams on another. As one of my colleagues says, we've produced the far left, the far right, and the far out within the state of Minnesota. Something has changed in Minnesota in terms of our politics. And so what I'm suggesting is what we're starting to see is the emergence of a new normal, something more structural, something deeper than just simply what happened last session, or this session here. Because it would be easy to simply say at this point that the reason why the shutdown occurred was a conglomeration of short-term factors. There's no question about it. We have some short-term factors that contributed to what happened in terms of leading up to the shutdown. That we had a split in the legislature, rather split in the government between the governor's office and the legislature. We had a shift in terms of the changing of political parties controlling the legislature. We had dueling mandates, where we had a governor claiming one mandate, the Republicans claiming another mandate. We can all look at that and say it's short term. We can look at it in terms of saying it's about personality also. So we have all those sort of short-term possibilities, and I don't want to dismiss any of them in terms of possibilities. But we also could say that look at what's happened. Look at what's happened in terms of the fact that we don't seem to get our elections done on time. We don't seem to be able to get our budget done on time. And what the normal was supposed to be, finish the budget by that first Tuesday after the third Sunday in the month of May. What's happened is that no longer seems to be the normal. Instead, what seems to be the normal now, or what I was arguing a few months ago, the normal seems to be we got to get the budget done by when? The start of the new fiscal year. So the new normal seems to be moving and saying it's not get it done by our constitutionally mandated deadline, it's get it done by the fiscal deadline. However, as we saw in 2005 and now in 2011, it's not even so clear that the fiscal deadline is the real deadline that gets things done. I remember talking to reporters the week or so before the shutdown, before July 1st this year, and all the reporters kept saying to me, they're going to get it done, they're going to get it done. And I kept saying to them, you have more faith in human nature than I do. You have far more faith in the process than I do. And I said, I don't think it's going to happen. And I originally was thinking that it was going to be at least a month on the shutdown. Luckily, I was wrong in terms of that score. But clearly, what we're seeing now is that the new normal isn't now necessarily even getting it done by the fiscal deadline. I think of when all of us were little kids, at least it said something about me, maybe good or bad, is that the first time you take a chance doing something, your parents have always said, don't do X, don't do X, and you do it the first time, and you realize nothing really bad is going to happen to you, and so you take another chance, you take that little step. Okay, this may say more about me than you folks, of course. Okay. I always thought that the fear of not getting the job done at first by the constitutional deadline would pay political costs. It hasn't. Then I thought, clearly, not getting it done by July 1st will pay political costs, and people will be so scared in the legislature they won't take a chance and blow it. Well, they've now done it twice. The onus, the sting of not getting it done on July 1st is gone. And so now I want to suggest that what we're seeing is that we've been through it a couple of times. We survived the shutdown, therefore, no big deal. The point that I'm getting at is some new normal has emerged. Some new normal has emerged in terms of how we think about governing our political process and governing the state. And so we clearly have something that speaks to the fact that a new normal has occurred. Now, why? What has contributed to that creation of the new normal? As I suggested to you, and why the shutdown this year. Now, again, it would be very, very easy to sort of suggest that it's really simply about partisanship. Or something about the last election in terms of dueling mandates. And in part, that may be correct. But I want to take it back even further in terms of thinking about some differences that have started to emerge in the United States, and particularly in the state of Minnesota over the last few years, and in terms of putting it into context. And one of them is, I want to, at the root, not go into a discussion that oftentimes we see our political process engaged in. Oftentimes it becomes very easy for one side to demonize the other, for one side to say that the other side doesn't care, the other side is evil, the other side wants to be really destructive. And that seems to be the language that we have in our political system right now, and clearly such language is destructive. When you have such type of language, it of course makes it difficult in the end to then compromise with the devil, if in fact that's what you've called the other side. But instead, I want to take both sides seriously. I want to take, for our point of view here, Mark Dayton quite seriously. I want to take quite seriously the Republicans in the legislature and say that at the core, partly why we can explain the shutdown, why we can explain the emergence of the new normal, is because there's a real simple fundamental disagreement here. And it's a real fundamental disagreement over a really core question: why government? At core, I'm going to take it very seriously and say that we have dueling visions of why government and the role of government in our society. And that's at the core of a lot of the disputes that are going on. If this were my classroom, and I oftentimes do this, I teach, by the way, a class on economic development and economic policy. I used to be a housing and economic planner in one of my previous lives. I would write on the board the first day the question, why government? Or I'd do this in one of my public policy classes, and say that we have some very fundamental disputes here, again, between Dayton and the Republicans, maybe the Democrats in general, but I just sort of say Dayton and the Republicans in the legislature in general. And it really starts with, on the one level, that we can see in terms of the Republicans, both at the state level, and I see this at the national level, a view that is very skeptical, very critical of government in the lives of our society, and in a belief that instead that markets are a far superior way of delivering goods and services. And in part, this dispute goes back at least to the days of Ronald Reagan, if not further. Recall Ronald Reagan's first inaugural speech saying that government is the problem, not the solution. Or in 1988, giving a speech to, I forget who it was, where he said at one point the 10 most feared words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I think that's 10 words. Clearly, he's setting a tone to say that government is not necessarily, in fact, not necessarily good, but in fact, may in fact be harmful in many ways, interfering with marketplaces. And so that what we see, at least among many Republicans, is a belief that markets are, again, a superior way of delivering goods and services, that we can leave it up to the private sector to be able to solve our basic problems in our society, and that we need minimal government to be able to address our most basic social problems. Conversely, Governor Dayton and many Democrats, while they're not opposed to the marketplace, and I think that's important to understand here, is that we're not seeing a party that is opposed to free markets, contrary to what people may say. Instead, they're saying is that we see a different role of government versus the markets, that markets are good in what they do. Markets are outstanding in allocating sailboats. Markets are outstanding in being able to allocate things that's Mercedes-Benzes and cars. But on the other hand, markets are not always efficient in doing a variety of different things. Markets are not efficient in being able to deliver health care, evidenced by the fact we have 44 million people at any given time in the United States without health care. Markets are not necessarily efficient in dealing with some of the basic social pathologies in our society. Markets are not always efficient in terms of being able to address issues of pollution. So instead, what Democrats have said is that we need to have the government out there to be able to address what economists would say are market failures, to address and provide for things such as public goods, to address and create a partnership with the private sector to be able to create a good society. And thus, we see this difference, a difference in roles between the two sides. And with that, we see fundamentally differences in how things such as taxes are viewed, how regulations are viewed, and a whole host of things are viewed. And I just mention that because at some point we forget about that. is that there's a core philosophical difference that's out there that oftentimes takes place. And that I think is one of the most healthy things that has happened in our legislature and at the national and state level, is that we're starting to bring up those really core questions about differences in philosophy and differences on the most fundamental question in our society. And I would like us to see us have that kind of a question, that kind of a debate, because I think that would be far better than sort of the he said, she said, or they're to blame, we're not to blame type of discussion. So first, I want to say that what we have here in terms of contributing to the new normal is this concept of saying that we've developed an emergence of a quite different approach in terms of the question of how to address the question, why government? Now, we have always had that question. We have always had that question in our society over why government and what it should do. But it has not historically been a partisan question. The partisanship that has emerged is really the product that has emerged in the last 30 to 40 years, perhaps maybe a little bit longer. And I mention that because think about sort of the patterns of political parties in the state of Minnesota and nationally in the last, let's say, at least generation or two. Is that I at one time look at the state of Minnesota of having a Republican Party, for example, that had the looks or the likes of David Durenberger, Arnie Carlson, Tom Horner, Harold Stassen within it. I look at a Republican Party that had both liberals and conservatives and moderates within it. At the same time, I look at a Democratic Party across the state and across the country that had similar mixes. I grew up in New York State, and I tell people that at the time that I grew up in New York State in the early 1960s, my governor was Nelson Rockefeller, a Republican. My first senator was Jacob Javits, a Republican. My other senator was Bobby Kennedy, a Democrat. Who was the most liberal of the three? Jacob Javits, the Republican, by a long shot. Bobby Kennedy was the most conservative of them. We saw a Democratic Party nationally that had the likes of Wilbur Mills in it and the likes of a Ted Kennedy at the same time. What we saw a couple of generations ago were two parties that were ideologically more mixed. They were not parties based upon ideology. You had conservatives, Democrats, and liberals all mixed within them. And the reason why that was important was that it made it easier to reach agreement. It made it easier to negotiate because it didn't become a partisan issue. You could clearly call Republicans over for Democratic initiatives, Democrats over for Republican initiatives, because you had a mix of ideology that was out there. And that made debate possible, made negotiation possible. But what we've seen occur in Minnesota and nationwide in the last two generations, and especially in the last 30 years, is really the polarization and the purification of the two political parties in many ways. I tell a funny story. In 2008, I was giving a talk at the University of St. Thomas Law School. It was early October. It was a discussion on something about civil rights under the next president, and we didn't really know who was going to win, although we suspected it was going to be Barack Obama. At the talk was Senator David Durenberger, whom I've known for quite a while, and I think he's a faculty member over at St. Thomas. And afterwards, it was about 4 o'clock. I'm in the reception line getting some snacks after the end of the day, and I'm standing in line with Senator Durenberger, and David turns to me and says, well, I don't know if I should get a snack here or get a snack at my next reception. And I said to him, where's your next reception? And he said, at a Barack Obama fundraiser. And I looked at him and said, David, I've known you for a decade. Since when do you go to a Barack Obama fundraiser? And he said, since I no longer feel comfortable within my own political party. And I mention that because for every David Durenberger in the Republican Party, there's an equal number of Democrats that oftentimes feel the same thing about their party, feeling that they don't quite belong there and that the polarization doesn't seem to sort of really capture where they stand. For many moderate Democrats, they feel that way. For many moderate Republicans, that feel that way. And the reason why I mention that, we can look at statistics at the congressional level and increasingly at the state level in Minnesota and look at the increased straight party line votes that occur in Congress and the state legislature and how that has changed over a 20 or 30-year period in terms of now that the two parties are much more polarized and very less likely to be able to capture votes from the other side. Now, there are going to be some people who are going to argue and say, well, the reason why we can't get people from across sides to vote with one another is we have dumb laws in place, for example, such as the gift ban law in Minnesota that makes it impossible for lobbyists to buy legislators gifts and food and for them to get together. Well, John Marty, who's a very close friend of mine, who I've worked with for many years, and I worked with Common Cause for many years, and helped push the gift ban law. Sort of my response has always been that, this is blackmail. For legislators to say, I can't work with somebody on the opposite side of the party unless a lobbyist buys me lunch. That's no different than a 5-year-old saying, if you don't buy me this toy, I'm going to hold my breath. No. If you wanted to have lunch with somebody on the opposite sides of the aisle, go invite them out to lunch. So no, it's not about the gift ban law. It's not about the fact that we can't let lobbyists buy people lunches anymore and buy legislative influence. No. And so it's not about that. It's about, first, I'm going to keep doing recapitulations. It's about, first, basic polarization or difference over a fundamental question of why government that has then taken on a layer of what? It has taken on a layer of partisanship in the last few years. Thus that now we have two different parties representing in many situations two opposing ways to think about that basic question about why government. But we can take it further. It is not just simply then, in terms of the shutdown, this very different of approach to why government, why taxes, the role of government in our society, faith in markets versus faith in government. It's also in terms of new tactics, new strategies, in terms of how parties get together and actually more importantly, how campaigns and elections, I should say, are undertaken in the United States and in the state of Minnesota in terms of our campaigns. And think about it on one level. I used to be, back in New York, a city director of code enforcement. I used to enforce the city and state housing laws. I used to be a person who had to clean up all the basic stuff when tenements fell apart, when people left garbage around, lawns weren't cut, sidewalks weren't shoveled, et cetera, et cetera. And I used to tell people that I could run for city council in any community in the United States on a basic platform that said, if elected, I'll make sure the police pick up the bad guys, the fire people put out the fires, the garbage people pick up the garbage, et cetera, et cetera. It's about the basic quality of services, the basic core set of issues that are out there. And I used to be able to argue and say that the fundamental skill that you needed to be successful in politics is something that we all know. It's the capacity to negotiate, to compromise, and to listen to other people. We all know this in our own business, that if you don't listen, if you don't compromise, you don't get anything. However, think about now running for office in the United States or in the state of Minnesota. I run on a campaign that says, if elected to office, I promise to think critically, listen carefully, negotiate, and work out compromises with the other side. You think I'm going to get elected? Not a prayer in the world. It's not going to happen. I get elected what? If I say that the other side is evil. The other side is the devil incarnate, and I'm going to go to Washington. I'm going to go to Capitol and St. Paul, and I'm going to clean up that act. I'm going to basically throw out the bums, fill in all the kind of language you want. The point being is that on top of the polarization, on top of the differences in terms of partisanship, we've developed a set of campaign tactics and a set of rhetoric that really now is zero-sum game. It's winner take all. I was listening to National Public Radio a couple of days before, about 3 days before it looked like the debt deal deadline in August. They were interviewing somebody who was a member of the Tea Party who said that if Obama wins, we lose. That was a simple phrase. And other people were saying the same thing. I don't know how you sort of run government where you sort of say that this is a winner-take-all, it's a zero-sum game. But politics has become that. We've developed a set of tactics in terms of campaigning that do that. And what we wound up seeing as part of the Minnesota shutdown is that we clearly had two sides that took a winner-take-all approach. We clearly saw language leading up to the July 1st deadline and afterwards, notions of saying that if one side wins, the other side loses, or something like that. And clearly, that is not healthy and that is not productive in terms of our political system. Hold on a second, excuse me. Thank you. And so clearly on top of that, we have a difference in terms of how we campaign. And what I would describe that difference is in terms of the triumph of ideology. That ideology seems to be far more important now in the state of Minnesota and leading up to this to our impasse here than it is in terms of pragmatism, in terms of it is to actually be able to solve certain types of problems. And so it's this belief of ideology over pragmatism that seems to be causing problems. But I want to point to a few other issues that are out here in terms of thinking what pushed us to that new normal, pushed us beyond July 1st. It is almost trite now to say in the media that we have red states and we have blue states. You know, red states indicating Republican, blue states indicating Democrat. And people like to say, for example, that the state of Minnesota is a purple state, that we are a little bit of both. And I want to say that that is probably an incorrect characterization, that more accurately, the state of Minnesota is a polka dot state. A polka dot state where we have enclaves of red, enclaves of blue. And the reason why I mention that is that a lot of why the shutdown occurred had an incredible amount to do with base politics. That is the politics of appealing to your base. That for both sides, both the Democrats and Republicans, they had enormous political incentives to be able to move on and to continue the impasse. Why? Because their bases were telling them, don't give in, stick, hold firm. And more importantly, think about the pattern of redistricting in the state of Minnesota. I am not here to fault the Minnesota Supreme Court, who I thought did actually a quite good job drawing the district lines the last time. But at best in the state of Minnesota, out of 201 legislative seats, I would garner to suggest no more than 30 or so of those seats are truly swing and truly competitive. And because of the demographics in the state of Minnesota, where people have chosen to live, even under the best of scenarios, you probably could not draw district lines to produce more than maybe a quarter of the entire legislature that is probably truly going to be swing in terms of the sense that it could go from one to another. And what that means, of course, then, is that for lots of people who are in Democratic-leaning districts or Republican-leaning districts, they don't feel the wrath of swing voters. They've got certain seats. And so when a lot of reporters would come to me and say, well, don't you think for some chance that the fear of not being reelected, the fear of not getting their job done is going to cause legislators to coalesce and to come together? And I said, no, not a prayer in the world. And they would say, why? And I'd say, because the redistricting doesn't work in that way. The redistricting and the demographics in the state have produced a polka dot state that reinforces the polarization in the state. One of my neighbors, I have to change his name, or ex-neighbors, because some of you might be able to figure this out. I live in St. Paul. His father used to be a state legislator, a Republican state legislator. I live in a part of St. Paul that is probably in the Summit Hill area that is probably one of the most heavily Democratic neighborhoods in the entire state of Minnesota. And my next door neighbor would always complain about the fact that there was no chance that he could ever elect a Republican in that district to represent him in the state legislature. And I used to turn to him and say, yeah, you're absolutely right. Not a prayer in the world. It's never going to happen. He, of course, eventually moved. as a result. But the point is that it was clear to him when he used to say, I have no stinking representation in this district, and was very, very distraught about the fact that he felt like there was absolutely no incentive to vote. And in many ways, there was no incentive for him to vote. And so I point out that base politics is important, redistricting is. But one more thought on the base politics. Think about the squeeze that the Republicans were under, especially. And this is where I connect it to somebody like Michelle Bachmann. Michelle Bachmann gets elected to the state Senate. How? By running to the right of a moderate Republican. Do what I say, take a position that I want, or I'm going to run against you. For many Republicans, had they decided to move and compromise with Dayton, raise taxes or something, I can almost predict to you that they would be facing the same onslaught of primaries that Gary Leidig faced when Michelle Bachmann ran against him before. They were caught between the base politics and at the same time having to compromise. They had no room to be able to negotiate and were forced in many ways to go to the direction that they did. So think about it then. We have a series of issues here. We got the polarization, we've got the partisanship, we've got a series of campaign tactics, we've got a series of redistricting and the polka dot nature of the state of Minnesota, all creating long-term structural forces as well as short-term political forces that lead to what? Lead to a scenario where it created very little incentive, very little wiggle room to actually be able to compromise. That's a lot of what occurred here in terms of why the shutdown started to emerge and why it did actually occur. But I'm going to come to a couple other things too, because I clearly want to hit one non-political thing and then talk about the legacy and then open up for questions. A lot of political factors clearly drove us to where we were, longer-term ones. But I also want to say, and I've been harping on this for several years, there's something fundamentally wrong with Minnesota's budget process. Think about the way I can describe our Minnesota budget process. We have an election. The previous governor puts together the budget. A new governor takes over in November, normally, in terms of after being elected, to be able to refine, not taking over in terms of sworn into office, but knows who it's going to be and has time then to modify that budget. Legislature comes into session early January. Legislature then waits for what? About 4 weeks for the governor to then introduce the budget. The legislature then waits another 4 weeks for the second fiscal forecast to occur to figure out where we really stand on the budget. And then we wait another few weeks until we actually get the target deadlines to put together the Minnesota budget. And thinking about the legislative budget or the state budget, state session rather, as being 5 months, the first 2 months of the session are devoted to what? Waiting to get to the point to do the job. Rena Sarnopoulos at Care 11, not far down the street from here, I described this to her and said at one point, think about it if you were hired for a job 9 to 5 or 8 to 5, and suddenly you didn't get to work until about 11 o'clock. Would you be able to get your job done? And she turned to me and she said, yeah, I would, because the news has to go on at 5 o'clock no matter what. But I still understand your point. And the point that I'm making here is that we've made it difficult to get the job done when in fact we spend the first 2 months waiting to get things done. Now, I know we have some legislators here, and I'm trying not to insult some of you in this one, but when I think over the years, in terms of some of the wonderful things that we have done in those first 2 months, we've worried about debating whether or not we're going to legalize Texas Hold'em in the state of Minnesota. We've worried about, I think, duck raffles and a variety of things like that. This is hardly productive time to be engaged in while we're waiting to put together a budget. We essentially have a budget process that is broken. It is structurally broken. I describe it as a horse and buggy budget process for a rocket scientist or 21st century era. It makes no sense to have our process set up this way when we spend the first 2 months almost twiddling our thumbs waiting to get around to doing the major work. Deadlines need to be shifted. Alternatively, what also doesn't make sense, and we saw this at the state level and at the national level, we have an election in November. We then have 40 or 50 people new in the legislature, individuals who barely know where the bathroom is, let alone know anything about the state of government. And we now say to them, go and construct a $34 or $37 billion budget for the next 2 years. I don't know about you, I couldn't do it right off the bat. There's a learning curve issue there. And so we may be thinking about saying that the budget process needs to be shifted. Perhaps maybe we move it to saying that the budget process or the budget doesn't occur until the second year in office. Let people learn what they're doing. Am I getting the hook? How am I doing?
We're running out of time.
I will need 2 more minutes and I am done. Okay. Do we have time for questions?
No.
Oh, okay then. All right. I will stay around. Sorry, I went longer than I thought. Okay, let me just say a couple last things here then. Okay, the budget process clearly is broken, the point that I want to make here. Now, what in terms of what do we look at in terms of winners and losers and so forth? Well, in terms of winners and losers, the clear loser is the state of Minnesota. I mean, we really didn't solve any of the budget problems. We shifted all those budget problems to either next year or more likely down to 2013 to solve it. We still have the same structural deficit we did before, but we're in a weaker position than they were even in the past. Because, as I think Representative Winkler pointed out, we clearly now have pushed to the future a series of problems, and with that, what we have done is it created more in bond indebtedness. Essentially, what we've done in the state of Minnesota, in my opinion, is that even though in theory we have a balanced budget requirement, the fact that we have borrowed so much, the fact that we have this recurrent structural deficit suggests to me that we are really not operating with a balanced budget, that we are really operating with deficit spending at this point, and we have been unwilling and unable to sort of come to the reality of that. And so when I look at it in the end, we have to ask, who are the winners, who are the losers? I thought all along that Mark Dayton was going to apply a 4-2 strategy. 4-2 being he doesn't come up for election for 4 years. 2014, the legislature comes up for election in 2012 in 2 years. I thought he would use that to his advantage and for negotiation. And what struck me is how he didn't do that, and how in many ways he finally, in the end, gave in more so than the Republicans did. And for a lot of the reasons that I don't have enough time to sort of specify, I will make you wonder for questions why he was more likely to give in. Thank you very much. Of course.
We just have a couple of minutes. First of all, thank you very much. That was very insightful, very interesting. If you have a couple of minutes to hang out, I think people might appreciate that. I just have a couple of announcements. First of all, to let everybody know that the TwinWest annual celebration is coming up on October 13th. It's at the Sheraton Minneapolis West. And please join me as we review the past year and look forward to what's ahead as the Chamber kicks off its new year. So this event thanks our outgoing board members, committee chairs, and especially the sponsors and volunteers who ensure the success of our organization. We also are going to recognize the top TwinWest supporters through the Circle Awards program, pass the gavel to the new board chair, Greg Korstad of Larkin Hoffman Attorneys, and pass the TwinWest Foundation gavel to Lisa McDaniel of Voyager Bank. So please, everybody, come out to that. It's a really fun event where we just celebrate ourselves, which is fabulous. And also, you don't want to miss our next legislative breakfast, which is October 14th. We will be taking a close look at Reform 2.0, which is the Republican initiative spearheaded this past August that will certainly impact government reform bills in the 2012 legislative session. So our featured speakers will include House Speaker Kurt Zellers, as well as State Representative Ryan Winkler will be there as well, and they'll share their differing perspectives on government reform and what that means to the business community. So contact Judy if you'd like to sponsor that. And also, I believe, and Judy's going to give a shout out if I'm wrong, if you came to this breakfast and you thought, wow, this is fabulous, I want to come to all of these breakfasts, connect with Judy and get a pass. We've got some great events coming up. Judy's done a fabulous job of getting folks booked here, and we'll be announcing some of those coming up as well. Finally, thank you again to our sponsors, Grand Casino Mille Lacs and Hinckley, also Comcast, CenterPoint Energy, Voyager Bank, Swank Audio Visual. Have a great Friday and a super weekend, everybody. Thank you.